You shouldn't be here.
I could not rest, Your Highness, knowing you were alone.
Welcome to African Ruth Stories, where we share the rich cultural heritage of Africa.
In the kingdom of Aurelia, people often said that Prince Adrian Vale had everything a man could ever want. He had a name that opened every door. He had wealth that could have built cities. He had a future crown waiting for him like the sunrise waiting for the morning. But what no one talked about was the silence that followed him through grand halls, the silence that sat beside him at crowded banquets, the silence that grew louder after the accident that changed his life. At 29 years old, Prince Adrian was admired from a distance, respected in public, and discussed endlessly behind polished fans and whispered cups of tea. But ever since the carriage accident on a stormy mountain road 5 years earlier, people no longer looked at him the same way. They looked first at the wheelchair, then at the title, and only rarely at the man. And somewhere deep inside that quiet ache, the prince began to wonder if anyone would ever choose him for reasons that had nothing to do with pity or power. Then, one spring morning, a maid entered the palace. She came without jewels, without ambition, without a grand name behind her. And before the season was over, she would become the one person brave enough to love a prince not for his crown, but for the heart he had almost forgotten he still possessed. This is the story of the crippled prince and the maid who changed the future of a kingdom by doing one simple thing. She saw him. Aurelia's royal palace was the kind of place that made strangers stop speaking the moment they stepped inside. Sunlight poured through towering arched windows. Marble floors reflected chandeliers like still water. The walls were lined with portraits of kings, queens, and ancestors whose eyes seemed to follow every guest with calm judgment. It was beautiful. But beauty, Prince Adrian had learned, did not always feel warm. On most mornings, he sat near the eastern gallery where the sun arrived first. A servant would bring tea. A clerk would bring state papers. A physician would ask polite questions about his legs, his fatigue, his pain. Adrian would answer with the same steady courtesy every time. Yes, I slept well. Yes, the exercises helped. No, there is no need to worry. He had become excellent at protecting other people from discomfort. Some days he used his cane for short distances. On other days, especially when the pain returned sharply, he used the wheelchair. The doctors called his condition complicated but stable. The palace called it unfortunate. Society called it tragic. Adrian called it exhausting. Not the injury itself. He had made peace with much of that. It was the expressions that exhausted him, the forced softness in voices, the over-careful praise. The way every conversation with an unmarried noblewoman eventually bent toward sacrifice, reputation, duty, or sympathy, as if marrying him would be a gesture of character rather than an act of love. One afternoon, while reviewing invitations in the music room, Adrian looked up to find his mother watching him from the doorway. Queen Helena was a graceful woman whose presence softened every chamber she entered. She still carried herself with the quiet certainty of someone who knew the weight of the crown and wore compassion anyway. "You've ignored 3 invitations this week," she said gently. "I answered them," Adrian replied. "You sent regrets. I sent honesty." She walked to the window, folding her hands in front of her. "The court is restless. Your father hears it every day. Ministers pretend they are asking about the future of the kingdom, but what they are really asking is whether you intend to marry." Adrian let out a quiet breath. "And if I say no, you won't say no forever." His eyes returned to the papers. "That depends on whether forever keeps offering me women who smile at my title and lower their eyes at my chair." Queen Helena's expression dimmed with understanding rather than offense. "You still think no one can truly love you," she said. "I think too many people love the idea of me." Before she could answer, footsteps sounded in the hall. King Rowan entered with the measured stride of a man who rarely rushed and almost never repeated himself. He was older now, silver at the temples, but still broad-shouldered and commanding in the way of men who had spent their lives being listened to. "There is a solution," the king said, already halfway into the room. Adrian gave him a tired smile. Whenever you begin with that tone, father, it is never my solution. King Rowan set a sealed document on the table. A season at court, he said. 3 noble women, respected families, educated, mature, accomplished, and old enough to know what life truly is. No girls, no games, no foolishness. Adrian's jaw tightened. A parade, a possibility, said the king. A performance, Adrian corrected. Queen Helena intervened softly. It would not be a spectacle. We would keep it dignified. The prince looked from one parent to the other. He knew their concern was real. So was their hope. They wanted his happiness. They also wanted stability for the throne. Both things could be true, and that was what made it difficult. Fine, Adrian said at last. Let them come. King Rowan nodded once, satisfied, but Adrian added, I will not pretend interest where there is none, and I will not reward anyone for treating me like a wounded investment. The king's expression sharpened, but the queen spoke first. Then don't, she said. Let them reveal themselves. Adrian did not know then that someone else would arrive that same week. Not a lady. Not a duchess. Not a woman dressed for a throne. Just a maid with clear eyes and careful hands. And for the first time in years, the prince's lonely life was about to be interrupted by something more powerful than duty. Gentleness. Elara Dawn had never imagined that the palace gates would open for her. She had grown up in the lower town, where roofs leaned close together and laundry lines crossed like flags of ordinary survival. Her mother, Miriam, had once worked in the palace sewing rooms before an illness forced her to leave. From that time, she had kept one thing safely wrapped in linen, a letter of commendation from the queen herself. Kind hands, the letter had read. Honest work, good judgment under pressure. When Elara was 24 and her mother finally strong enough to breathe without pain on the stairs, Miriam placed that old letter into her daughter's hands. Take it, she said, not because you need rescue, because you deserve a door. Elara had tried to refuse. She disliked the idea of being pitied. She disliked even more the thought of entering a world where rank determined how loudly one was allowed to exist. But wages in the lower town were shrinking, medicine was costly, and opportunities for women without status rarely knocked twice. So on a cool Monday morning, with one neat bag and a plain blue dress, Elara walked to the palace. She expected interrogation. She expected dismissal. She expected to be told that recommendation letters from another decade belonged to another world. Instead, she was led through a side corridor lined with fresh lilies and shown into a small receiving room where Queen Helena herself stood examining household records. Elara bowed at once. The queen turned, and for a moment there was only recognition. Not of Elara, but of the handwriting on the folded letter. Miriam Dawn, said the queen softly, your mother stitched the winter cloaks the year of the great frost. Elara looked up, surprised. Yes, your Majesty. She once worked 16 hours straight because the palace nursery flooded and the children needed dry blankets before dawn. Elara smiled faintly. That sounds like her. The queen's face warmed. And you? I can read, keep accounts, polish silver, prepare simple trays, mend linen, arrange flowers, and follow instructions. I also know how to stay calm when others lose theirs. There was no arrogance in the statement. Just truth. Queen Helena liked truth. You'll begin in the West Wing household staff, she said. Temporary placement. If you do well, you stay. Relief nearly rose to Elara's eyes, but she kept her composure. Thank you, Your Majesty. Before she was dismissed, the queen added, one more thing. In this palace, kindness matters just as much as skill, perhaps more. Elara answered without hesitation. Then I hope I'll do very well here. Within an hour, she had been introduced to housekeeper Mrs. Bramble, shown the service halls, instructed on meal protocols, and warned politely about the arrival of noble guests. 3 ladies are coming for the spring season, Mrs. Bramble whispered as they walked. The court already smells like speculation. Elara almost laughed. And what does speculation smell like? Perfume and nerves. By late afternoon, Elara was assigned a tray of tea and letters to deliver to the Eastern Gallery. "Be quiet, Mrs. Bramble said. His Highness prefers peace in the afternoon." Elara nodded and made her way across sunlit stone, through carved double doors, and into a room full of golden stillness. That was where she saw him for the first time. Prince Adrian sat near the window, one hand resting on the arm of his chair, the other lightly touching the open page of a book he was not reading. He was younger than she expected and far more serious. Not cold exactly, just someone accustomed to keeping whole storms behind calm eyes. Elara had been told to lower her gaze, place the tray, and leave. Instead, she noticed that the tea had been poured too close to the edge, and the cup would slide if the tray tilted again. Without thinking, she crossed the remaining steps carefully, adjusted the saucer, and said, "There, that should be easier." The prince looked up, not offended, not impressed, simply surprised. Most people entered his space as though crossing sacred glass. This maid moved like someone trying not to spill tea. "You're new," he said. "Yes, Your Highness." "What gave me away?" Elara blinked, then realized he was teasing. "A prince in a sunlit gallery with a book and 3 unread letters," she said. It seemed likely. Something rare flickered at the corner of Adrian's mouth. A smile. "Your confidence is dangerous for a first day." "I didn't mean disrespect." "I know." She inclined her head. "Would you like the windows opened a little wider, sir?" "It's warm." Most people asked what his legs needed. She had asked what the room needed. "Yes," Adrian said quietly. "Please." And just like that, before titles, expectations, and courtly intentions had a chance to interfere, the first thread between them was tied. Not by fate, by ease. By the end of the week, the palace had transformed. Florists filled the central halls with white roses and climbing ivy. Musicians rehearsed in the southern salon. Silver reflected candlelight even before dusk. The court's appetite for romance had been officially fed. The 3 noble women arrived on separate afternoons, each with her own carriage, attendants, and reputation. Lady Seraphina Hartwell came first. She was 31, sharp-minded, elegantly dressed, and known throughout the northern provinces for her charitable work and perfect hosting. She understood rooms quickly and had the calm posture of someone who was rarely wrong. Lady Celeste Moray arrived next. At 28, she was warm, luminous, and socially effortless. She could make strangers feel known in under a minute, and she wore beauty as though it had never once inconvenienced her. Lady Vivienne Ashford came last. She was 30, poised, thoughtful, and quieter than the others. Her strength was not performance, but observation. She listened more than she spoke, which in palace life could be either a virtue or a strategy. The court loved them immediately. Servants whispered about dresses. Courtiers speculated about alliances. Ministers noticed dowries even while praising grace. The king reviewed lineage. The queen observed character. Prince Adrian observed distance. He welcomed each guest with courtesy. He dined with them. He listened to their stories. He answered questions about music, law, architecture, and history. He was never rude, but neither was he easy. Elara saw little fragments of these encounters while moving through the palace with trays, flowers, and folded linens. She noticed how the ladies spoke to the prince. Some spoke too softly, as though they were addressing a wound rather than a man. Some spoke too brightly, as though optimism could erase discomfort. None of them seemed cruel. Yet something always shifted in the room when they became aware of the chair. All except one. Not one of the noblewomen. One of the servants. Elara. She had now been assigned occasionally to the prince's reading room because, according to Mrs. Bramble, His Highness has not once asked for you to be removed, which is a higher compliment than people realize. One evening, while adjusting a stack of returned books, Elara glanced at the titles and said, "You like histories where everyone speaks in long sentences and suffers in silence." Adrian looked up from the window. "That is a remarkably specific accusation." "It's not an accusation," she said. just a pattern. And what do your books contain? I borrow practical ones, she answered. Herbs, old folk tales, maps, and sometimes poetry when I want to feel ambitious. He turned his chair slightly toward her. Poetry is ambitious? For people who work long days and still want language beautiful enough to forgive the world a little. Adrian stared at her. No courtly flattery, no careful pity, no rehearsed admiration. Just a maid with plain sleeves and an inconvenient habit of speaking honestly. What's your name? He asked. Elara. He repeated it once, quietly, as if testing how it sounded in the room. That same night, during supper, Lady Celeste asked Adrian whether he missed dancing. The table fell gently silent. The question had been innocent, perhaps even kind, but like so many kind questions, it reached straight into an old ache. Adrian answered with practiced grace. I miss movement less than I miss being in rooms where people don't measure me by what they assume I've lost. No one spoke for a moment after that. Later, long after the guests had retired, Elara returned a forgotten book to the gallery and found the prince alone in the dark except for firelight. She hesitated. Would you like me to leave the book here? He looked toward her voice. Stay for a moment. So, she did. After a silence, Adrian said, Do you ever feel that people decide what your life means before you even speak? Elara considered the question. Yes, how do you live with that? She set the book down gently. By speaking, anyway. It was not a grand answer, but it stayed with him. And in a palace filled with polished conversations, that simple truth began to sound more precious than any elegant promise. The palace ran on routine, and so did Prince Adrian. Morning tea. Stretching exercises. State correspondence. A walk in the inner terrace, if his legs permitted it. A midday rest he never admitted needing. Dinner he rarely finished. Music late at night, when the rest of the palace softened into sleep. Elara learned these rhythms the way some people learn tides. Not intrusively, not possessively, just carefully. She noticed which days the prince's pain made his patience thinner. She noticed that he disliked anyone moving objects without asking. She noticed he became quieter whenever physicians used phrases like limitations or realistic expectations. What surprised her most was how much he disliked being helped in front of others. If a servant rushed too quickly, Adrian stiffened. If a noble guest reached for his chair without permission, his expression closed. If someone praised his courage after watching him cross a room with a cane, he became polite in the way people do when they want distance more than conversation. One rainy morning, Elara entered the music room carrying fresh linen cloths for the tables. Adrian was trying to reach a violin case placed on a high shelf where a careless footman had left it. Without thinking, she moved toward it. I can manage, he said at once. His tone was not angry, but it was sharp enough to stop her. Elara stood still. Then I'll wait until you do. Adrian paused. Most people would have insisted, or apologized, or backed away with embarrassment. She simply stayed. After a brief, stubborn effort, he exhaled and gave a small, humorless laugh. The thing about pride is that it makes even shelves feel judgmental. Elara stepped forward, took down the case, and set it gently beside him. There, she said. Your pride may keep the victory. He looked at her, and this time he laughed for real. That laugh changed something. From then on, he spoke more freely when she was near. He told her which books he hated but pretended to admire for the sake of scholarship. He told her that the palace dining room echoed too much and made every meal feel like a formal announcement. He told her that before the accident he had once ridden for hours just to watch sunrise from the western cliffs. And after? She asked. After, people kept telling me what I still had, he said. As if gratitude and grief cannot live in the same room. Elara lowered her eyes for a moment. That sounds lonely. It is. Then, because she understood loneliness too well to leave it unnamed, she told him a small truth of her own. When my mother was ill, she said, everyone praised me for being strong. No one asked whether I was frightened. Adrian studied her face, hearing in those words the same hidden weight he carried himself. Were you? He asked. Yes, what did you do? I kept moving, she said. Some seasons only let you survive 1 useful hour at a time. The prince sat very still after that. There were women in the palace trying to charm him with grace, lineage, and polished affection. And yet it was a maid with tired hands and steady eyes who had just given him the most comforting sentence he had heard in years. 1 useful hour at a time. From then on, Adrian began asking for the West Garden route whenever he wanted to go outside. It was quieter there, farther from the main salons, and Elara was often assigned nearby. He told himself it was the roses. It was not the roses. The West Garden had once been one of the finest parts of the palace. Long, curved paths wound between fountains, climbing roses, and white stone benches. There had been concerts there in summer and lantern walks in autumn. But years of neglect and redirected staff had left portions of it tired. Ivy overgrew railings. One fountain no longer ran. The herb beds had lost their labels. It was still beautiful, but in the way old music is beautiful even when someone has forgotten the last verse. Elara loved it immediately. On her rare free half-hours, she knelt by the herb rows and trimmed what she could without permission to damage official grounds. She straightened garden tags. She tied back vines. She spoke to the older gardener, Mr. Tolland, who was delighted to find someone under 60 interested in lavender drainage and root rot. One afternoon, Adrian noticed the change. He had asked to be taken to the West Path because the palace had become too full of voices. Elias, his advisor, left him there with a book and instructions to ring if needed. Instead of reading, Adrian watched Elara in the distance. She was retying a fallen climbing stem with a strip of soft cloth, talking quietly to Mr. Tolland as though the fate of the entire kingdom might depend on whether the roses had enough space to breathe. When she finally noticed him, she walked over and curtsied lightly. "Your Highness, have you declared private war on the garden?" he asked. She smiled. "No war. Rehabilitation." He glanced toward the cleaned herb beds. "It does look better." "It was sad," she said simply. "Sad? Yes, places can feel neglected just like people." The words landed between them with more meaning than either pretended to notice. Adrian looked across the pathway. "If you had full authority, what would you change?" Elara's eyes lit with caution, less enthusiasm. The bench near the fountain should be turned slightly towards sunset. The jasmine needs support trellises before summer. The broken fountain should be repaired because the silence there feels unfinished. And the far path needs smoother stone. Your wheels catch at the cracks. Adrian blinked. He had expected remarks about flowers. Instead, she had noticed the path from his perspective. "You think about that?" he asked quietly. "I think about whatever is in front of me," she said. "And that path is unfair." 2 days later, the king passed through the West Garden and found the prince reviewing sketches with the chief groundskeeper. By the end of the week, a restoration plan had been approved. Not grand, not wasteful, just thoughtful. The queen, who understood more than anyone guessed, asked no unnecessary questions. The 3 visiting ladies were invited to contribute ideas for the spring garden luncheon that would reopen the West grounds. Serafina proposed elegant floral symmetry. Celeste suggested live musicians and a reading corner. Vivienne recommended broader paths and lower seating walls for comfort. Adrian listened politely. But when the architect asked whose notes had first mentioned accessible pathways, the prince answered without hesitation. "Elara, Dawn." There was a small silence after that. A maid's name spoken in a planning meeting with nobles, ministers, and the heir to the throne. No one objected. But everyone noticed. Elara, when told about it later, looked almost alarmed. "You shouldn't have said my name there." "Why not?" Adrian asked. "Because palaces don't like lines being crossed." He held her gaze. "Perhaps some lines deserve to be." She looked away first, though not because she disagreed, because suddenly the air between them felt far more dangerous than protocol. It felt personal. As the season progressed, the palace created opportunities for observation disguised as elegance. There were teas, walks, recitals, supper conversations, charity meetings, and formal visits to the archive wing. Each event was designed, openly or not, to reveal which woman might best stand beside a future king. Prince Adrian endured these rituals with patience. Queen Helena studied them with intelligence. And Elara, though never the focus, saw far more than anyone assumed. Lady Seraphina was capable and composed. She would have managed a royal household flawlessly. But there was always a controlled distance in the way she spoke to Adrian, as though she admired him deeply without ever forgetting the practical implications of that admiration. Lady Celeste was kind, genuinely so. She often included servants in her thanks and remembered names quickly, yet she longed for brightness, travel, celebration, and movement. Elara sensed that Celeste wanted a life too fast and public for the quiet resilience Adrian now required. Lady Vivienne was perhaps the hardest to read. She seemed to understand the prince's silences without fearing them. She never reached for his chair, never overcompensated, never reduced him. But her heart, Elara thought, lived elsewhere, perhaps in books, perhaps in independence, perhaps in a life that did not require her to become a symbol for an entire nation. During one afternoon tea, Queen Helena arranged a simple test no one recognized as a test. A late message arrived saying that heavy rain had delayed a supply carriage for the town infirmary supported by the crown. The women were asked casually what they thought should be done. Seraphina suggested an immediate inventory review and budget release. Sensible, Celeste proposed sending palace kitchens to prepare extra food. Generous, Vivienne recommended shelter coordination and medical prioritization. Thoughtful, then the queen asked Elara, who was quietly refilling cups near the window, "And you?" Every face in the room turned. Elara froze only for half a second. "I would ask what the people there need first," she said. "Sometimes help arrives beautifully and solves the wrong problem." Queen Helena smiled very slightly. Adrian did not smile at all. He simply watched Elara with that focused stillness that meant something in him had been moved. Later that evening, he found her in the side corridor carrying folded linens. "You embarrassed me," she said at once. "I wasn't aware I had spoken. You looked pleased. In a room full of people. That is almost the same thing." He laughed softly. "You answered well." "I answered honestly." "I know. That's why it mattered." She shifted the linens in her arms. "The ladies answered well too. They did. And they are all more suitable than I am to stand in rooms like that." Something in Adrian's expression changed. He said, very quietly, "Suitable is a cold word." Elara's heartbeat stumbled at the tone in his voice. She tried to step back toward safety, toward formality, toward whatever distance still remained useful, but Adrian continued. "Do you know what everyone here keeps offering me?" He asked. "Suitability, alliances, stability, graceful acceptance, measured devotion. They offer me futures that make sense. And that is not enough?" She whispered. "No," he said. "Not if they do not feel alive." The corridor was silent except for distant footfalls and the rain beginning against glass. Elara looked down at the linens because looking directly at him had become too difficult. "Your Highness," she said carefully, "some paths cannot be walked simply because the heart wants them." Adrian's answer came after a long pause. "Some cannot be abandoned for the same reason." Neither of them said more. Neither needed to. Because by then, the truth had already arrived, not as a confession, not as a promise, but as a quiet and unmistakable pull neither could dismiss anymore. That night, Prince Adrian could not sleep. The palace had long since quieted. Rain traced the windows. Somewhere in the distance, a clock marked each quarter hour with unbearable patience. He remained awake in the private study, a lamp burning low beside him, one sheet of paper blank beneath his hand. He had intended to write to no one in particular, perhaps only to the part of himself that still believed caution was wiser than longing. Instead, he found himself writing Elara's name. He stopped at once. Then, he began again. Not a declaration, not a confession, just thoughts. That he felt less alone when she entered a room. That she spoke to him as though dignity were ordinary, not something he had to earn back each day. That the palace felt less like an institution and more like a place where human life might still happen when she was near. He wrote for nearly an hour. Then he folded the paper, sealed nothing, and placed it inside a drawer he did not lock. The next morning brought bright weather after rain, and with it the reopening luncheon for the restored West Garden. The fountain had been repaired. Jasmine now climbed fresh trellises. The benches angled toward the evening light, just as Elara had suggested. Smooth stone had replaced the roughest section of path, and Adrian's chair moved across it without resistance for the first time. Guests praised the design. Courtiers applauded the transformation. The king made a brief speech about renewal, stewardship, and the value of tending what others overlook. Adrian listened, then turned toward Elara, who stood back near the service arch with the other staff. For one unguarded second, their eyes met, and in that look was a dangerous amount of gratitude. Later that afternoon, while most guests rested, Lady Vivienne requested a private conversation with the prince in the garden. Adrian agreed. Vivienne was honest from the beginning, which made him respect her more than ever. "You are kind to me," she said, seated opposite him beneath the shade of a cedar. "So I will be kind in return. The court believes I am considering a future with you." "You are not?" "I am considering a future that belongs to me," she said. "That is different." Adrian gave a faint smile. That may be the wisest sentence spoken in this palace all month. She studied him for a moment, then said, "You are not waiting for one of us, are you?" He did not answer. Vivienne followed his gaze unintentionally to the far terrace where Elara was collecting empty glassware. That was answer enough. "I see," she said softly. Adrian looked back at her, suddenly wary. "You see what?" "A man who has already begun to choose," Vivienne replied, "and a woman who is trying very hard not to be chosen for the wrong reasons." He was silent. Then Vivienne leaned back and let out a gentle breath. "For what it's worth, Your Highness, I do not envy crowns nearly as much as people assume, but I do envy clarity. And I think you owe it to both of you." "To say what?" "The truth," she said. Soon that evening, Elara was assigned to dust the prince's study while he attended a council meeting. She never touched private papers. She never opened drawers. But when a sudden gust from the terrace windows scattered several loose documents onto the floor, she rushed to collect them before the inkstand overturned. One folded page slid open in her hand. She did not mean to read it. But the first line was her name. "Elara," she froze. Then, against every instinct of propriety, her eyes moved once across the page. Not enough to consume it, just enough to understand. He felt less alone because of her. She set the paper down at once, her breath catching in her chest. By the time Adrian returned, the study was in order, and Elara was gone. But something had changed. Because now the truth lived in two hearts instead of one, and neither of them could pretend much longer that it was harmless. Chapter 8, A Rainstorm, a Greenhouse, and a choice 3 days later, the sky darkened over Aurelia without warning. Wind swept across the palace grounds. Servants hurried to secure awnings and close shutters. Guests were called indoors. The king postponed an evening reception. Thunder rolled low enough to rattle glass. Adrian had been in the West Garden with Elias reviewing accessibility plans for the summer festival routes when the rain broke hard and sudden. "Inside, now," Elias said. But the nearest covered path had flooded, and the chair wheels caught at the edge of soaked gravel. Before Adrian could object, Elara appeared from the side path with a cloak over her shoulders and water on her sleeves. "The greenhouse," she said. "It's closest." Together, with Elias pushing from behind and Elara guiding the front wheels through the safest turns. They made it into the old glass house near the herb wall just as the storm deepened. Inside, the air smelled of damp earth and rosemary. Rain hammered the roof panels in a silver roar. Elias, seeing that the prince was safe, left to summon additional staff and dry blankets. For the first time in many weeks, Adrian and Elara were alone without ceremony around them. The greenhouse glowed green and gray around them. Water slid down the glass. Vines trembled softly from the force of the wind. Elara knelt beside the chair to adjust the prince's rain-damp blanket away from the wheels. "You should let people help you more quickly when the sky looks like that," she murmured. "You sound like my doctor." "No," she said. "He sounds like someone paid to be worried. I sound like someone who simply is." Adrian looked at her for a long moment. Then he said it. "Elara, if I speak honestly now, will you stay?" Her hand stilled. "Yes," she whispered. He drew in a breath that seemed to come from years deeper than the room around them. "I have spent so long being looked at that I forgot what it feels like to be known. Since you came here, that has changed. I find myself waiting for your voice, your observations, your impossible honesty. I think of what you would say when rooms become false. I notice when you are absent, and every sensible part of my life is telling me to remain silent." Rain struck the glass harder. Elara lowered her eyes, not from rejection, but because emotion had risen too quickly. "Your Highness, Adrian," he said softly, "at least here. At least now." She looked up. "Adrian," she repeated, as if the name itself were a line she should not cross, but had already crossed in her heart. He continued, "I do not want to place a burden on you. I do not want to make your work difficult or your position dangerous. But I cannot keep pretending that what I feel is passing." Elara's hands trembled once before she clasped them together. "What if what you feel is born from loneliness?" she asked. "Then loneliness has better judgment than half the court." Despite herself, she smiled through the strain of tears. That was a very royal answer. It was a very frightened one. Silence settled between them again, warm now despite the storm. At last, Elara spoke. "I care for you," she said. "More than I should, more than I intended. I tried to keep it small, respectful, invisible, but feelings do not always obey good manners." Adrian let out a breath that sounded almost like relief breaking apart. "Then, what do we do?" Elara looked toward the rain-blurred glass. "We tell the truth carefully, and we do not turn kindness into scandal." When Elias returned with staff and blankets, he found both of them composed, but not unchanged. Because in that old greenhouse, during a storm that kept the whole palace behind closed doors, the crippled prince and the maid had finally done the one thing neither rank nor fear could prevent forever. They had spoken plainly. And from that moment on, every smile, every silence, every step forward would carry the weight of something real. If love had only belonged to two people, life might have been simple. But palaces were made of consequences. Within a week, the atmosphere at court had shifted in ways small enough to deny and obvious enough to feel. Adrian seemed lighter when Elara was nearby. Elara became more careful in public, which only made perceptive people more observant. Queen Helena noticed. Vivienne already knew. Serafina suspected. Celeste hoped she was imagining it. The first real conversation came from Lady Vivienne. She approached Elara one afternoon in the library where sunlight rested in long pale stripes across the floor. "You needn't be frightened of me," Vivienne said. Elara nearly dropped the catalog ledger in her hands. "My lady, I wasn't, you were," Vivienne replied kindly. "And sensibly so." Elara lowered her gaze. "I mean no disrespect to anyone. I know." Vivienne stepped closer, her voice gentle. "For what it is worth, I never came here hoping to win a reluctant heart. I came because my family expected consideration, and because I thought perhaps duty and compatibility might meet somewhere pleasant. But what I have seen is not duty." Elara said nothing. Vivienne smiled faintly. It is rare when someone looks at a prince and forgets to perform. Rarer still when the prince remembers how to breathe because of it. By evening, Adrian had spoken privately with Lady Serafina as well. Serafina received the truth with admirable poise. "If you had chosen me," she said, seated with perfect posture in the blue salon, we would have governed well together. I know, Adrian answered. But you would not have loved me. He held her gaze, not the way you deserve to be loved. She nodded once. No dramatics, no bitterness, only intelligence. Then do not insult either of us by hesitating out of politeness, she said. A future queen can survive disappointment, especially when it is honest. Lady Celeste took longer. Her sadness was visible not because she was possessive, but because she had truly hoped tenderness might grow between them. When Adrian spoke with her beneath the east balcony, she listened in silence, fingers resting lightly over one another. At least tell me one thing truthfully, she said at last. Was I ever close? Adrian answered with care. You were always worthy of affection. But my heart had gone elsewhere before I understood it had moved. Celeste's eyes glistened. Then she smiled through it with genuine grace. Then, I hope she protects the part of you this palace keeps trying to manage. She does, he said. Celeste gave a small nod. Good. What Adrian did not expect was what came next. The three women, separately but sincerely, began treating Elara with unmistakable respect. Not as a rival, not as a servant beneath notice, but as a woman whose heart had entered difficult territory and chosen decency anyway. One morning Celeste complimented Elara's flower arrangement. Another afternoon Serafina requested her opinion on the infirmary linens because you notice practical things the rest of us miss. Vivienne simply sat beside her on the garden bench and said, You look tired. That means you're carrying this carefully. Elara could hardly process such kindness. She had feared humiliation. She had feared whispering. She had feared becoming a cautionary tale. Instead, she found herself quietly upheld by women strong enough not to make pain cruel. Queen Helena, when she finally called Elara to her private sitting room, was the one person whose opinion mattered most. Elara entered with trembling composure. The queen looked at her for a long moment, then said, Do you care for my son? The maid answered the only way she could. Yes, your majesty. For his title? No. For the hope of becoming more than you are, Elara swallowed. I do not think loving him makes me more. Only more responsible. Queen Helena's face softened. That, she said, is the first answer that has given me peace. The Royal Spring Festival had long been planned before any of this began, and Aurelia did not cancel traditions lightly. Lanterns were hung across terraces. Musicians rehearsed late into the evening. Town leaders, foreign envoys, artists, and scholars were invited to the final banquet of the season. It would be the event at which the court expected, formally or informally, that Prince Adrian might signal a future direction. Adrian knew this. So did the king, which was why the tension between father and son finally rose to the surface 2 nights before the festival. They met in the council chamber after dinner, alone except for fading firelight. King Rowan stood by the mantel, one hand braced there, his expression unreadable. You mean to disrupt the expectations of half the kingdom, he said. I mean to stop arranging my life like a treaty. A king's life is not private. A man's heart is not public property. The king turned. Do not reduce this to romance. The throne requires stability. And what is unstable about truth? Rowan's voice sharpened. Truth? You would place a maid beside a crown and call that simplicity? The court will challenge her. Nobles will question motive. Ministers will doubt judgment. You may endure that, Adrian. But can she? The prince held his father's gaze. She has more steadiness than most titled people I know. The king was silent for a long moment. Then, to Adrian's surprise, his anger thinned into something more exhausted than severe. When you were injured, Rowan said quietly, I thought only of how to protect you. From pain. From pity. From being diminished in the eyes of men too shallow to understand strength. Perhaps in protecting you, I began trying to protect the throne from uncertainty in the same way. Adrian's expression changed. And now? He asked. Now, said the king, I am trying to determine whether I am looking at recklessness or courage. The answer came not from the prince, but from the queen, who had entered unnoticed at the doorway. "You are looking," she said, "at a man who has finally found joy without performance." She stepped into the room and looked from husband to son with equal tenderness. "Ask yourself," Helena continued, "whether the kingdom truly needs a polished illusion or an honest future." The king said nothing then, but neither did he forbid what was coming. The following evening, the festival began. Lanterns glowed like stars brought close to earth. Musicians filled the grand terrace with strings and piano. Guests moved in jewel tones beneath the open spring sky. The restored west garden shone softly beyond the banquet arches, and the fountain carried moonlight like silver thread. At one point during the music, couples began to dance. Elara stood at the edge of the terrace with the service staff, pretending her attention belonged entirely to the silver trays in front of her. Then Adrian wheeled toward the center of the floor. The musicians faltered for only a fraction of a second before continuing. All eyes followed him. He stopped near the middle and lifted one hand toward Elara. The world seemed to go still. She stared, breath caught, unable to move. He did not command. He did not announce. He simply waited. So she stepped forward. The prince had arranged it quietly in advance, a seated dance adaptation with measured turns, hand-led pacing, and a circle of open space wide enough for dignity, not spectacle. As the music rose, Elara placed one hand in his. He guided. She followed. Then she guided, and he followed. It was not a dance built on what he had lost. It was built on what was still possible. The terrace watched in silence so complete that even the lantern flames seemed to listen. No one would forget that moment, not because it was dramatic, but because it was true. When the music ended, some guests were wiping tears they had not expected to shed, and King Rowan, standing beside Queen Helena, said very quietly, "I see it now." Chapter 11. The banquet declaration, the final banquet of the spring season, was held in the Hall of 12 Crowns, the largest ceremonial chamber in Aurelia. Candles stretched in golden rows, crystal reflected music and conversation. The long central table held enough silver and white linen to impress every envoy in 3 kingdoms. Yet beneath all the grandeur ran one clear anticipation. Would the prince choose? After the final course, King Rowan rose first to speak. He thanked the visiting families. He praised the women who had honored the court with their presence. He spoke of spring as a season of renewal, judgment, and hope. Then he turned toward his son. "Prince Adrian," he said, "the kingdom has watched this season with affection. If there is anything you wish to say, speak it now before this court." Every face turned. Adrian sat tall, calm, and completely certain. He moved his chair forward into the light. "When I was younger," he began, "I thought titles made life clearer. I believed duty would always know where to place love. But life has a way of humbling those illusions." The hall remained still. "After my accident, I learned many things," he continued. "I learned patience. I learned the cost of pain. I learned how quickly the world can begin speaking about a person rather than to him. Most of all, I learned that admiration and understanding are not the same gift." His eyes moved briefly across the room, touching the king, the queen, the 3 ladies, and at last the place where Elara stood frozen near the side arch. "This season I was offered grace, intelligence, kindness, and honor by women any kingdom would be proud to claim. Lady Seraphina, Lady Celeste, Lady Vivienne you have, each shown dignity that deserves public gratitude." The 3 women inclined their heads, each composed in her own way. Adrian drew one steady breath. But a crown should not be given where the heart cannot follow, and my heart has chosen. There it was. A subtle intake of breath moved through the room like wind across silk. Adrian turned fully toward Elara. "Elara Dawn," he said, and the sound of her name in that vast hall seemed somehow both impossible and perfectly right. You came to this palace with no claim except honest work. You asked for no attention. You expected no favor. Yet you gave me something no title ever could. You saw me without shrinking from my pain or reaching for my crown. You gave me friendship when I was weary, truth when I was guarded, and peace when I had almost forgotten how it felt. Elara could not move, not because she was afraid, because she was overwhelmed by the tenderness of being known aloud. Adrian's voice softened. I will not summon you like a subject, he said. I will ask you like a man. The hall vanished for everyone except the two of them. If you are willing, he said, walk toward me not because this room is watching, but because your heart is free to answer mine. Elara took one step, then another. The silence around her was not hostile. It was reverent. When she reached him, Adrian extended his hand. She took it. He looked up at her with a steadiness more intimate than any declaration the court had ever heard. Elara Dawn, he said, would you allow me the honor of building my life with you? Tears stood in her eyes, but her voice, when it came, was clear. Yes, she said, not for the crown, not for the hall, but for you. The chamber exhaled all at once. Queen Helena closed her eyes in gratitude. Lady Celeste smiled through tears. Seraphina sat straighter, proud rather than wounded. Vivienne looked almost relieved. Then everyone's attention moved to King Rowan. The king stepped down from the dais and crossed the floor himself. He stood before Elara for one measured moment that seemed to contain the opinion of the entire kingdom. Then he held out his hand. Elara placed her trembling fingers in his. You entered this palace through the servants' gate, he said. If you remain, you will do so through the front of history. Serve this family with the same honesty you have already shown my son, and I will stand with you. Elara bowed her head. Overcome. Thank you, your majesty. No, said the king, looking briefly at Adrian. Thank you. And just like that, the future changed. Not through conquest, not through scandal, but through truth spoken in a room finally brave enough to receive it. In the weeks that followed, Aurelia did what kingdoms always do after surprising themselves. It adjusted. There were murmurs, of course. There were editorials, noble opinions, raised eyebrows, and deeply invested conversations among people who believed tradition should arrive wearing familiar shoes. But there was also something stronger. Public affection. Because once the story spread beyond the palace, not a fantasy, but the simple truth that the prince had chosen a woman known for honesty, care, and steadiness, many people loved him for it even more. Not because she was a maid, but because he had recognized worth where rank had not taught others to look. Queen Helena oversaw Elara's transition with remarkable sensitivity. She did not try to erase Elara's origins or force polish where authenticity already carried grace. Instead, she gave her education in state protocol, history, diplomacy, and court custom while preserving the qualities that had made Adrian love her in the first place. Never become decorative, the queen told her one morning while reviewing formal seating traditions. A palace will always try to turn useful women into symbols. Resist politely. Elara smiled. I believe I can manage politely. King Rowan, true to his word, supported the match publicly and consistently. In private, he and Elara developed an unexpected rapport based on practical governance. To his great surprise, she had intelligent views on household economics, staff well-being, and medical access in the lower districts. Within a month, she had convinced both king and prince that every future public building funded by the crown should include smoother access routes and seated mobility design from the beginning, not as an afterthought. You see unfair paths everywhere, Adrian told her once as they reviewed plans together. That's because unfair paths are everywhere, she replied. He laughed. Marrying you may transform the entire kingdom. That is not my plan. It may happen anyway. The three ladies departed Aurelia with dignity and new directions of their own. Seraphina later accepted a major civic leadership post in the north and was said to be thriving. Celeste turned her energy toward patronage of music and education, where her warmth became a public gift. Vivienne chose travel and scholarship, sending the queen occasional letters that were clever, affectionate, and blessedly free of regret. As for Adrian and Elara, their engagement was not a fairy tale in the childish sense. It was better. It was built through real conversations about pain, difference, duty, class, and the uneasy work of joining two lives shaped by unequal worlds. There were evenings when Adrian's condition left him exhausted and withdrawn. There were days when Elara felt the invisible weight of being watched too closely by society. There were moments when old fears returned, but by then they had learned the habit that mattered most. They spoke anyway. One useful hour at a time, one honest conversation at a time, one hand reaching for the other before silence could harden into distance. On the first anniversary of the West Garden restoration, the palace hosted a smaller gathering than usual. No grand spectacle, just music, family, staff, and the people who had become part of the story. At sunset, Adrian and Elara sat beside the once broken fountain. The bench faced exactly where she had said it should. The water moved softly. Jasmine climbed in bloom. The path beneath his chair remained smooth. "Do you remember the first day you came here?" Adrian asked. "I remember nearly dropping your tea. You corrected the tray," he said. "No one else ever notices the tray. That is because everyone else was busy noticing the prince." He turned toward her, smiling with quiet wonder that had not faded even after all this time. "And you?" "I noticed a man trying very hard not to be treated as fragile." Adrian reached for her hand. "And now?" Elara looked at him, really looked, the way she always had. "Now I see the same man," she said, "only happier." He brought her hand to his lips and kissed it softly. Behind them, the palace glowed gold in the falling light. Not colder than before, exactly, but changed. Changed by ramps built where stairs once excluded. Changed by policies written with dignity in mind. Changed by a king who had learned flexibility, a queen who had trusted character, and a prince who had chosen love without apology. And changed, most of all, by a maid who had entered through a side gate and quietly taught everyone in the kingdom that human worth had never belonged to titles in the first place. Years later, when people told the story of Prince Adrian and Elara Dawn, they often began with the obvious things. They said he was the crippled prince. They said she was a maid. They said the court had expected one future and received another. But those who understood the story best told it differently. They said there once lived a prince who feared he would only ever be seen for what fate had taken from him. And then one day, a woman arrived who saw what remained. And because she did, an entire kingdom finally learned to see it too. So if you ever visit the old West Garden in Aurelia, you will still find the fountain running, the jasmine climbing, and the bench turned towards sunset. And if the evening is quiet enough, perhaps you will understand what the palace itself eventually came to know. That love does not always enter with ceremony. Sometimes it arrives in a plain blue dress, carrying a tea tray, and changes everything without raising its voice at all. And that is how a lonely prince in a wheelchair found the one heart that never bowed to his crown, never feared his pain, and never mistook gentleness for weakness. Because the maid who loved him did not fall for a title. She fell for the man.
Thank you so much for watching this video till the very end. I really appreciate you spending your time with me here. If you enjoyed the video, please give it a like, subscribe to the channel and hit that bell icon so you never miss an upload. Your comment and support mean the world to me and they truly help this channel grow. Let me know in the comment what you would like to see next. Take care of yourself. Take blessed and I will see you in the next video.